For all your latest news and rumors of the UFC, go to thefullmountmma.com. Now back to the TFM Live podcast. Here's Brian Coyle and Sean Stanley. Sean Stanley, Brian Coyle back with you. Don't forget, check us out, our articles at thefullmountmma.com. Follow us on Twitter at thefullmount. Now, Brian, before we left, you kind of teased something.
Yes,
a little bit about free agency.
Yes. Free agency is a new concept, kind of, to mixed martial arts. I mean, we've seen it in the NFL. We've seen it in Major League Baseball, every sport you can imagine. But the UFC has dominated the world of mixed martial arts for a while now. I mean, taking out the WEC and Strikeforce. Bellator has been kind of there. But honestly, when you look at the serious mixed martial arts, you go to the UFC. Interesting article came out from Bleacher Report. Mike Chiappetta, as I mentioned earlier, where he talked to Benson Henderson, Josh Thompson, Matt Mitrione, all guys that have moved on to Bellator. And this got me thinking, is free agency viable right now? Like, could you see top-level fighters? I mean, Mitrione, for me, he never really accomplished much in the UFC heavyweight division, and that's a division where you could get a couple wins and all of a sudden kind of jump to the top. Benson Henderson, former UFC champion. Josh Thompson, who did work in the UFC. Do you see this is an actual thing that fighters can sort of leverage themselves against the UFC to get free agency? We've seen Alistair Overeem and Aljamain Sterling return to the UFC. What do you think about the concept of free agency in mixed martial arts?
I mean, I think ultimately, I mean, it's a good thing, but I think it's going to be more for the aging fighters or the fighters that are, not seen as product level for UFC as far as, like somebody that'll make them money.
Yeah.
Because I think, there's money out there to be had, especially when you go to maybe not the money that you'd make per fight. But when you're in Bellator and everything, you can get back your sponsorship money and things like that. So I think that ultimately is a big point. But I think also you've seen it. The UFC just doesn't let everybody walk.
No.
They pick and they choose who they let walk. And they believe there's a business decision, I have to believe, behind who they're letting go. So when you look at the free agency, they're kind of like, okay, go make more money because you're not worth the money you want to make with us here. To me, that's what they're saying. So, I mean, because ultimately you looked at what they get, Overeem, all these guys, Sterling, things like that. They've kept those fighters. The ones they saw something in or they believe they see something in, they kept them.
Yeah.
So,
continue. No,
go ahead. Sorry.
I was going to say, Mitrione also kind of said something that caught my eye, and I wanted to get your take on it as well. He compared the MMA business, saying it's very similar to the NFL business. There's no promise of loyalty. If you're expecting the business aspects of things, you're going to get your feelings hurt. I guess I'm the same way. I'm hurt because I displayed loyalty and none was giving back. He talked about a conversation that he had with Lorenzo Fertitta where apparently, this is according to Mitrione, Fertitta alluded to the fact that the UFC will be the UFC. People tune in for the show. People do not turn in for the fighters. I have a hard time believing that to be the actual words because the UFC is built on the best fighters. But he does make an interesting point because the Reebok deal happened out of nowhere. It killed a lot of fighters' money. Mm-hmm. They are independent contractors. Like, there's a lot of money being spent by the UFC, not on their fighters' welfare as much as they could. I think it seems like a very individualized case basis, and the fact that the sponsorship money is way out the window and the Reebok payouts are not good. It's an interesting thing to talk about, especially when you have a fighter like Rory McDonald, who only made $59,000 for his fight of the year against Robbie Lawler, who's got one more fight coming up against Wonderboy Thompson. And that's the end of his contract, and Rory is a star in waiting. Like, the UFC is going to have to do all it can to make sure he stays, because some of these fighters are getting very disenchanted with the way contracts are set up.
I mean, I think they're getting disenchanted, but at the same time, do you leave to where you're fighting the very best to just go down and collect the check?
That's the thing.
I mean, so then you're fighting against great. You're the Bellator champion, and there are good fighters in Bellator. So please, I'm not trying to say like everybody is bad there, because there are some great fighters there. But you're looking at the best of the best at the UFC and the level there. So and something you said, whereas like I think Fertitta, if he did say that, maybe the words were misconstrued as he said it, but don't they show that it's more about the production or whatever than the fighters by just plugging and playing with 11 main events and co-main events, if that's the number, and they're still doing great business? That kind of shows you that they can plug and play with these fighters, and people are still going to tune in.
And that Bleacher Report article also stated Benson Henderson is told Bleacher Report that at least 15 current UFC fighters have contacted him about dealing with Bellator, including a couple of UFC champions. Phil Davis says he gets questions all the time, former light heavyweight. They asked me, there's nothing crazy on that side of the fence. They just want to make sure it's straightforward business.
Yeah.
And obviously, where the information is coming from, you have to take it that it's biased information.
Well, I think you got to, if you're a fighter, you got to do your due diligence and see what's best for you, because, again, the UFC has pretty much told you, hey, look, they don't really care about your money, because they did the Reebok deal without even thinking about what it's going to cost the fighters. I mean, you see that that they're really not for the fighter. I mean, I won't say not for the fighter, but with all the things that go on, they're business. They're not worried about, hey, look, you're great for these 2 fights, but if you start losing 2 or 3 in a row, you're gone.
I mean, you can compare it to what's going on in the NFL with Colin Kaepernick, because Kaepernick is guaranteed $11.5 million this year. But the Broncos want to trade for him and take $4 million away of the guaranteed money. Like, say, like, oh, just give up that money and we'll trade for you. Why in the world would you give up that money? You don't give away money that's in your pocket. Yeah. You're not just giving it away because.
But UFC kind of took that money out of their pocket.
Exactly. So we have to. This is something to monitor, because as Bellator grows, as World Series of Fighting grows, I mean, Ben Askren, one of the top welterweights in the world, fights at 1 over in Asia. So there's the UFC's power is basically not been trampled with, and it's getting bigger and bigger, and they're doing a great job with these main events.
Well, they make sure that they're signing the ones they know can do, the ones that could be maybe sway a little bit of that power over to Bellator. If they sign like one of their, if Overeem and Sterling both would have left and showed up at Bellator, say, now all of a sudden, you start losing a little bit of that luster, because now you're starting to lose names and stars in the making, or big names and things like that are right there in your, Overeem's, knocking on the door for a title shot, and now you lose him. I think they were more worried about the business side. Okay, now we start losing these guys, everybody's going to start going, okay, wait a minute, something's not right.
Yeah, it's a crazy thing to think about, like UFC champions leaving the promotion, and I think that may be a bit misconstrued and overstated. But if you get a guy like Sterling, who said on air on the MMA Hour with Ariel Helwani that UFC gave him the best option, and he's like the perfect little example. He's undefeated. He's a strong media presence. He's going to be on Fight Pass again against Brian Caraway in May, which I find very interesting, because the combined rankings of those guys are better than the combined rankings of Cody Garbrandt and Thomas Almeida, who headline that card currently in May, in the Memorial Day card. So I guess it's all about what you can get your money, and then figure it out later. You have to take it on an individual basis.